let's do something that looks like something. Yeah. In architecture, many architects are so busy saying, this is the thing. Sorry, this is a terrible generalization. I had to work at it. I was determined to communicate. A meandering and a glimpse and a hint. But I'm interested in these phenomena, the commonplace phenomena, the bland, the not so bland. I mean, I find Miami very bland. In fact, sometimes they fuck the context. This town needs cheering up. So then you invent your own context. And there was a dodgy bar on the site, which would be open till 3 a.m. I knew the site by going to the dodgy bar. So it's talking to the river, talking to the castle. It has its moments of context. To do something that works properly and also looks interesting and leaves some things unsaid until you discover them, that's much harder, much more interesting. But I'm speaking honestly, and at my age you could say, if you don't like it, fuck off. I think there's always going to be the need for the person who thinks outside the box. I see the role of an architect ideally as an inventor.
Well, Peter Cook, thank you so much for coming to this exhibition to participate in this interview project. Welcome to this exhibition, Out of Context, where we showcase the work of 7 architects from 7 different countries. Mm-hmm. And I invite architects who can share their wisdom and talk about their work, their inspirations. And I want to ask you to first introduce yourself. What do you do, and what is it you do here at WAF, Miami?
Okay, I'm Peter Cook. I'm from London. I surprised myself, 89 years old, and I'm still working, and I have a small studio. In the last 3 or 4 years, I've largely been working on the Neon project, which we can't publish, except for 1 or 2 things, and can't really talk about, which probably would never happen anyhow, but still, by the way. And then doing small things outside that. The last thing that people will have seen publicly was constructed a few months ago in Kensington Gardens by the Serpentine Gallery.
Serpentine Pavilion.
And it was the play pavilion, which was visited by many thousands of people, mostly children. There were always queues to use it. And it was an amusing thing to do. In a way, it's consistent with some of the things I was doing as projects way back called Instant City. In a way, the pavilion could well be a structure taken from the Instant City drawings, but of course developed to the current day. Otherwise, we do competitions. I do a lot of exhibitions right now, exhibitions of my drawings, and I would like to say that generally the drawings are bought and sold and exhibited as art pieces, but they always have an intentional content, which is about ideas for architecture. I couch these ideas in colored drawings, and I can't resist the color, and even the few buildings I've done are mostly quite colorful. And so, of course, the pavilion was a great excuse to use this sort of quasi-childlike, but actually because I enjoy it.
I think sometimes you wear shirts with imprints from your own drawings.
Yeah, this is something my wife instigated a year or so back. She secretly had one of my drawings printed as a shirt and gave it to me at a public event, which was quite funny. And then we've had a couple of times ties made as also birthday presents. One of them quite recently I got in San Sebastian, surprisingly, because it was my birthday and I was in a conference, and I haven't worn it yet. So I think at the next, I'm in Tallinn, Estonia next week, and I will see this drawing on the tie for the first time. It amuses me that sometimes I wear the shirt in the pavilion when there were some lectures we gave in the pavilion. And I was wearing the shirt of the drawing, but as I was in what is effectively a built drawing, I like to cross over from one situation. Otherwise, most of the time I sit in the studio with a few assistants and I draw and we do competitions and we try and make things and construct things.
Since you just mentioned your pavilion, Serpentine Pavilion, maybe you can talk a little bit about what was the main idea, what sparked it? And
well, it was a play pavilion. It was for children. They've never had such a thing before because normally the Serpentine only has non-British architects. And they broke the rule because they said, well, it's not a regular pavilion, it's a play pavilion. Okay. And it was, of course, paid for by Lego. That's the first thing. So one had to make it interactive. One had to have a certain content of Lego that kids, or adults for that matter, could come and play and make things. And then I introduced some sort of towers inside it that were a bit more heroic, but then the normal member of the public could add to the heroics. We then were very interested in seeing how fluid we could make Lego construction. And we went to Billund in Denmark and saw how some of their experts, in fact, their key design experts are actually in the Czech Republic.
Oh, wow.
And we worked quite closely together with the guys in Czech Republic and we made almost mosaic 3D constructions along using the carcass of the pavilion as a base, but also there was running through some other ideas which are constant in my mind, which is the notion of surprise or partial concealment. I have this feeling, and I've used it in building before and certainly in drawing, that you don't see everything at first. You see glimpses, you see hints, you see veiled conditions. It's not a full frontal architecture. And in the pavilion, again, we had these towers that you could only slightly glimpse from across the park. You wonder what they were, and then when you came in, you saw the full story. And it's that aspect that interests me, that I think in architecture, many architects are so busy saying, this is the thing. Get it? This is the thing. And I'm interested in that rather Gothic tradition. There's a process and a
you don't see everything at once.
Progression and a word is escaping me. A meandering and a glimpse and a hint. And I think that, to my mind, was always draw an analogy with English verbal culture or English literary narrative, where instead of, as in many cultures, you say, this is the hero, this is the hero, this is the evil one, and story press. In really successful English novels, there are hints that somebody might have evil within them, but they appear to be okay, or that somebody might actually have a heart of gold behind the evil actions, or that there'll be a side story which leads off into, this business of meandering and glimpsing and hints.
So architecture, in a way, becomes a storytelling
device.
Of course,
yeah. I mean, the thing of architecture as narrative, I think, has been discussed certainly for many years in the circles that I move in.
I want to ask you a very unusual, unexpected question. What kind of architecture gives you joy? And if you could maybe go back in your memories and discuss a couple of or several examples of...
Well, I can be specific, because in not today's lecture, but in a lecture which I shall be doing actually next week.
Where?
In Tallinn, and then I will be giving the same lecture again in Shenzhen and in Hong Kong. So the next
this is
three
how
lectures.
To be an interesting architect, or what's the name?
No, it's no.
Or where to derive
it's about
inspiration?
Piquante.
Spices.
But I start the lecture with a slide that has 4 buildings I like. I actually declare my taste, and I will tell you what those buildings are. One is the Bank of London and South America done in the 50s when I was still a student by Clorinda Testa, which is
Oh,
in
wow.
Buenos Aires.
Yes.
I think it's absolutely wonderful. I've seen it 5 times, different trips. It never tires. It's a wonderful building. Very explorative.
Has beautiful
very
cutouts
powerful,
in
but
concrete.
you know, it's also technologically a very interesting building. It's hung, and then it has a spatial quality where the other 3 sides of this small street intersection, they appear to be parts of the building you're in. It's a very clever thing. And then there's this extraordinary eyelid that drops out. That's one. And another one is the Pink Pipe in Berlin, the Umlauf tank.
Okay. This is in
by
Tiergarten.
Leo,
Tiergarten?
near the Technische University.
Yeah, on the same intersection, more or less.
Yeah, and it's this pink pipe thing, which when it's very interesting. I first saw it in about 1970. First time I went to Berlin, I think it was 70 or 71. And I had been very interested as a student in the drawings of Chernikov. But then by 1971 or 70, I sort of, yes, that was way back in the history, and my interest had moved. But then I saw this pink pipe underneath green legs and blue up. I said, this is Chernikov built. And of course, Leo himself, a very obscure.
You would never know where.
I met him only once, and then he was scared of us. The next I did, because I wrote about him in a magazine. But I said, Chernikov can happen. And if you look at the Graz building that I did with Colin Fournier, there's certain aspects of instinctive reference to Chernikov, particularly the cantilever needle. Anyhow, I digress. The other 2 buildings, the Palm House at Kew in London, which was done in the 19th century.
Wow.
And is a beautiful, it's a bubble building. Of course, it's not called a bubble building, but I make reference to it when I'm talking about
And
Graz
it's made
again,
of steel
because
plates?
Graz is said to be a bubble. But the guys were doing it in the 19th century. It's a steel with glass. It's a farmhouse, of which there are many, but it's a very beautiful one. It's a very elegant, beautiful. It's been usefully reconstructed so that it's still in good condition. And the 4th one, I'm trying to remember now. I blanked on what the 4th one is.
So I wonder if it's closer to our times, the 4th one. Is it a contemporary building?
No, they're all 20th century.
Okay.
Just can't remember what the 4th one is.
Not Sana.
No.
No.
No, nobody who's fashionable right now.
Okay.
It'll come in a minute. It'll come when I finish this interview. I'll walk across to the toilet and I'll suddenly think, it was so and so.
I want you to talk about your inspirations. What inspires you? Where do you derive your ideas when you start a project? What kind of questions do you ask?
I think something I always tell students. The thing is to look. It's a funny thing which my wife will comment on in her own way, which is that she does the driving. I don't drive a car. I've never learnt to drive. I live in a large city, and I don't use the countryside that much. And so, and then when I travel, I'm a pain in the ass. I spend a lot of time in Los Angeles. There's always somebody now, Uber driver or something, but friends, wife, whatever, who drive me. Now, I claim that I know more about the Santa Monica freeway because that's the freeway that we have most often used to go to teach, to stay in Santa Monica. I know that highway for 45 years now, but I have had the privilege of being able to sit looking out the window. The driver, sort of, it has to concentrate even on a freeway. Maybe particularly on the freeway. The driver is doing this. Peacock is sitting there. I see they built something. The new tower in Westwood. That's interesting. And you see what they've done to that? And the driver is still doing this. And this is a simple example. And that has enabled me to see a lot of things out of the window.
And that inspires.
And there's another thing, which is sort of a brief way of getting to the answer. I was an army brat, and therefore we moved town a lot in England. And so I had to get to know a new town a year or two later, another new town. And as a kid, you develop a peasant's instinct for where is the dodgy bit of town, where's the fish and chip shop, where's the model aeroplane shop, where's the bus stop, where is the castle on the hill, where's the cathedral, where's the smelly bit of town, where does the town, where do you expect to find the river crossing? I mean, these things which you can tabulate now as urban discussions, but it was just being a peasant. You had to survive with a new town. You bloody well get to sniff out how towns work. Certainly North European towns, which of course always have that characteristic that the wind blows from the west. Therefore, the rich people are on the hill on the west side, the poor people traditionally on the basin on the east side. And my God, you can tick off the cities, Berlin, London, that have this pattern, which of course has been changed because then in recent years, the smelly side is no longer so smelly, so the students move in, the artists move in, then the institutions move in, and then the West is left as a sort of strange thing, and then it revives. I mean, as we were talking about Berlin earlier this morning. But, so that's looking. The other thing is, I think that I'm naturally a Gothic person rather than a classic person.
So what's the connection?
I'm not very interested in abstracts. The only things I was really good at school was writing about history, English, narrative writing. I can always write very easily, very quickly. And I wasn't a naturally good drawer. There were many people in my class at both architecture schools who were much better drawers than me. I had to work at it. I was determined to communicate. But I'm not a natural drawer. I'm found now by this time tricks of the trade. But you draw all the
time, right?
I draw all the time, and it was only by just saying, "To hell with this! I'm going to try and draw how to get round that corner. I'm going to learn how to try and draw trees." I don't know whether I'm good or bad now, but I was a terrible drawer of trees. But then I worked on a competition with one of my students, who was a lady who was very good at drawing trees. And all of us in the group, we were watching how she drew trees. And then latterly worked with somebody else who much later, who could draw trees. Watch, again, another lady with the same name, but Greek rather than English. And she could draw trees. She could draw plants. And she worked on a project with me. And I watched how the other Penelope could draw plants. And you watch how other people do it. And I'm a user of traditional devices, the shablon, the French curve.
Curves, yes.
And the stencil and the square stencil. Any damn trick that can get the community. Then gradually, over decades, you get a bit more relaxed about it. You'll be able to. And I like drawing. I don't do sketches. I mean, gallerists and publishers go mad with me because they say, "Where are the sketches? Can we exhibit some early sketches? Can we show some?" I said, "I don't do them. I have some bad scribbles in a squared exercise book." As soon as I got the thing sniffing in my head, I do a bit of minimal pencil positioning, but very minimal. And even most of that I change as I simply then start. I mean, I am much more relaxed than I would have been 40 years ago.
You just mentioned a highway as an experience. What other visits to particular architectural projects, buildings, you can recall that were really striking, that left you kind of, really affected?
I think, for example, again, it's a highway version. It's something like Sunset Strip in Los Angeles, Sunset Boulevard, which is unfolding. And also topography thing, not just a highway that does that, rather like the ones here which sort of end the conversation. In fact, I find Miami desperately uninteresting, by the way. I shouldn't be saying that, but it is. But the sunset, starts at the beach, and then it goes up through trees and villas, and then it goes past the UCLA campus. Then it starts to move in when it really gets interesting, because hot bit is West Hollywood, and these billboards and so on unfold, and then it sort of becomes slightly tackier, and you read a whole series of aesthetics, sociologies, but it's a narrative, but it's a narrative distorted by the topography. Mm-hmm. Now that stuff I find really interesting. Same thing like, my childhood of finding a town. You say, well, this town is sort of similar to the last one. There's a river, and there's a river crossing, there's a castle, okay. But here, something funny happens behind the castle, makes it different. Something happens to the river, makes it different. Something's different about the hills either side of the river, or there aren't any hills. And you get the formula, then you have to be looking at the nuances. Now, some cities are very intriguing. I spent a bit of time teaching at Rice briefly, and in Houston. And Houston, because it's a strange town, the car town par excellence, much more than LA. And there's one street, I forget the name of it, but it runs from the sort of fairly smart bit of town, and it runs west for a long way. And you go along about 3 kilometers or so, and then there's a strip of shops. There's a Walgreens, there's a 7-Eleven, and the usual package. Okay. Go along further. And of course, I'm not driving, I'm looking out the window. 3 or so kilometers further, there's another strip with a 7-Eleven, Walgreens, but maybe the 7-Eleven's on the corner and the Walgreens not. And the Walgreens has a slightly different trimming around the roof. In other words, it's so boring, you have to really, really work at recognizing anything. Because if you go into London or New York or something, there's so much visually going on. Now then you get another version of this, which fascinates me, and I'm quite familiar with Tokyo, probably my second or third favorite city, or almost favorite. You go behind the big streets in Tokyo, and you're in a churn, you're in just a higgledy-piggledy area. And maybe you're staying in that area. Or somebody who lives in it, whatever. And you have to think, now I go down there, it all looks the same. First of all, easy to say, it all looks the same. There's a drinks machine on a corner. Well, there are many of those around town. But opposite the drinks machine is a pink air conditioner. Not so many pink air conditioners. And also there's a funny doorway. And you have to, that's what you can, and you have to pick up on stuff that in London, you'd never, somebody has a funny doorway, so what? There's a much more interesting thing on the corner across the street. But there, you have to pick up on these extraordinarily small items that are rubbish things. And then you start to begin to have a taste for it. You start to compare drinks machines. You say, that's interesting one. That's a double drinks machine with both hot and cold coffee. Whereas the one that I'm looking for is the one that doesn't have any coffee. Sort of things like that, which in my background, so in that respect, because suburbia, to take a European view, suburbia becomes very interesting. There's a love-hate thing, and I've gone in a revolve. In my childhood, I sometimes lived in nondescript suburbia of these towns. The middle of the town is always interesting, not so. But I now live, and for many years, for 30-odd years, in an old suburb, meaning 100 years old, and so it has built up a patina, and it was contrived. It's a part of town which was contrived to try to look interesting. So at the end of our street, in the same development done 100 years ago, are towers with OG tops. Of course, that starts to be iconic in its own commercial way. And you realize that then you start having, it's all to do with eye, it's all to do with looking and saying, and it's quite interesting, 'cause one street, our street has studios that were built on the top of the houses because it was to attract a certain clientele where in 1900 or 1910, the wife would do needlework in the studio. I did once hear a quartet rehearsing in one, but this is not general. So that it's like using the studio as a sales gambit, as developers do now. You know, it appealed to that clientele. The number of people actually painted like artists. I've never seen an artist use any of these studios. But I'm interested in these phenomena, the commonplace phenomena, the bland, the not so bland. I mean, I find Miami very bland. And it's downtown trying far too hard. And not being as interesting to me as LA, but that I know LA very well.
You know, it seems like you are very close to the ideas of Venturi, who was interested
yes, although I never found his
the
work
main
very
street,
exciting.
Kind of the ordinary as well as extraordinary, but also really inspired by the streetscapes. You know, you described
yes,
suburbia.
I mean, sometimes one then says, and this is a long conversation, because my generation since have talked a lot about contextualism. I don't think the few buildings I've done look particularly contextual.
No.
In fact, sometimes they fuck the context. This town needs cheering up. Or you're in a campus situation where, in fact, two cases, small campus and larger campus, because most of my stuff has been done on campuses, where the campus itself is new, has been grafted onto the condition. I'm one in Bournemouth, where I was also a student one time, and I built two little buildings. It's in a suburb. It's in a totally nondescript suburb. It was a field. Some cows were there when I was a student, and they built this. So everything is relatively new. Mm-hmm. So really context, what context is there? You know, some other people's new buildings, and then some rather suburban houses. In Vienna, of course, it was the building is next to the Prater Gardens, but then it was a hunting ground. I mean, again, the context was trees, which we acknowledged. But to say there's any sort of particularity about either of those sites, they're different. They're flat. There are trees. In one case, very suburban houses. In another case, a fun fair down at the end. What do you do? Do I design in the manner of the boring Bournemouth suburban houses? Absolutely not. In Prater, do I try and make it look like an extension of the fun fair? No, certainly not. So then you invent your own context. Now, in something like Graz, it's a little bit different.
Where did that come from?
Graz really came from probably big, in a sense, pure architecture, meaning I referred earlier, referring to my taste, that I was inspired by Chernikov. I was interested in the fluid. But basically, Colin and I sat down. We knew the site. Now, that's quite important. He, at the time, had a girlfriend from that town, and I had visited. I'd been on that site a few times because I would bring students from London to Graz and then Vienna, because I'm very interested in the Grazer Schule and the stuff going on. And there was a dodgy bar on the site, which would be open till 3 a.m. I knew the site by going to the dodgy bar. So I knew that site, and Colin knew the site even better, and we knew which was the noisy street, which is the place where most people go, which is the way that they cross the river, you know, what's behind, what's to look at from that corner. We knew the site before we did the competition. And we could sit and discuss how people use that place. So the diagrammatic part was not difficult. And we made a very direct, when I looked at the results of the competition, which there are 100 and whatever number exhibited, most people made it more complicated than we did. So maybe we should learn from it that it was actually very uncomplicated. We said, this is the corner where you have to come in from. There's no argument. This is the facade that you have to keep. You can't. You spend a lot of money keeping this facade, but you have to keep it. You know, this is where you will get the view. This is the alignment with the river. This is where you will get the view of the castle. And that was that. But the diagram was very simple. We said, come in that corner, and it's a hairpin that simply glides up, uses a travelator, which I liked as the sort of fingers to the pompousness of, you know, it's amused me as a throw in. The day we opened it, the Chancellor of Austria was going up the travelator with me. We both had a glass of white wine in our hand. We were chatting. But it was like as if we were in a railway station, you know. Not a sort of going up the grand staircase. And then you're in. I like things like that. So it was in a sense quite pure. And then we said, well, how do we wrap it? Well, we're going to wrap it like that. And the diagram on the ground...
But where did that come from?
Just came. Just was a natural wish to do. You know, you've got a body, you've got a thing, and you put a skin around it.
There was no specific reference.
No. But maybe secretly we'd been wanting to do something like that.
So what's the secret?
That I think we like the idea of gliding architecture. Gliding up the thing. Gliding through space, and then pocketing odd things.
And what about the skylights?
The skylights,
very characteristic.
The skylights were derived from, now I have to go into a bit of detail, there was an earlier competition for the same project on a different site, across the street, under the...
So you combined two
No,
proposals?
we had this idea of this tongue of light with skylights. And then we didn't get anywhere in the first competition, then they abandoned it, had the second competition.
So you recycled it, right?
So we recycled the idea. I think the skylights are too small. But my goodness, they work as an icon. If you imagine the building without, there are two things. If you imagine the building without the skylights, it's just a hippopotamus, right? The skylights say this is a building to do with looking. But I would have, in retrospect, made them bigger, technically, because they needed to be big. But they work very well for articulating the light fittings, also to continue this idea of looking. And then, of course, the naughty nozzle is very key. I don't know if you know this. They all point north, because it's north light. But one doesn't. One points there. When you go up to it inside, it points exactly at the castle, which is a funny old... It looks like a cuckoo clock. So it's talking to that building. And then the Needle, which was intended as a restaurant originally, is now a sort of venue, very popular. It lines with the river, so it's talking to the river, talking to the castle. It has its moments of context, actually. And so I find that in the case of the most recent building before the pavilion, it was done during lockdown, the second building in the Bournemouth campus, which faces really the most boring 1970s suburban housing. The local people were saying, and they saw the drawing, which is colour, you know, has a sort of coloured swirls on it. It's a cheap building, but it has colour. And oh my God, you know. And then our client, who's a lovely guy, he discovered that in the local art museum was a famous painting that used the same colour.
Wow.
And he told the public, he said, well, you know, it's referring to this famous painting, which is complete bullshit, actually. But now I would claim that they have something to look at. They come out of their extremely tedious, nothing suburban street, and there's this mural, and the building curves away. I think we did them a favour. And we haven't heard a murmur since we built it. I mean, that's a consistent thing. Graz, there was a newspaper which interviewed however many people and said 70% of the public does not like this project. When it was projected, that it was built, they did a survey again. 70% of the public love this building.
Loves this.
And now it's on, you know, national posters and chocolate bars and
It's very popular.
And it's so, because it raises this whole weird thing about the iconic. Because I have a sort of, again, love-hate relationship with the idea of the iconic. I think it's an easy trick, an easy throw to say, let's do something that looks like something. Yeah. To do something that works properly and also looks interesting and leaves some things unsaid until you discover them, that's much harder, much more interesting.
What do you think about the current situation in the profession?
I think the current situation, I mean...
Would you say we are in crisis, or
no? I think there's a certain
moment?
kind of psychology which always says there's a crisis. I mean, okay, I won't talk about American politics. It may well be a crisis, but I think that there's a certain sort of person who says, I can't do anything. It's, I only did this because there's a crisis. I think they have a mentality, and they always, the sort of people who need religion or Marxism or something to cling on to. I think if you're a natural optimist and you're actually interested in things, there's always, it might be a bit, I mean, the English psychology, you have to understand, it's always terrible, but it might get better. And you've seen worse. You have to bear in mind, I was a child in the wartime. I can still remember bombs falling. Fortunately not on me, but and small amounts of food and eating dried egg and so on. Okay, so when it came to the lockdown period, and people say, I mean, we were lucky. We have a good garden. And we had a good spring. The spring weather was good. I was sitting in the garden. I was building a gazebo in aluminium pieces. Quite pleasant. Drilling, gluing, making some drawings. We had a relatively good lockdown. And as soon as we could fly out, we were on an airplane. You'd get somewhere and then there'd be another lockdown. We'd be flying back.
I wonder if you have a recipe for how to be an interesting architect. You've done many lectures on this topic.
I'm interested in the issue, and I don't have a formula, but I suppose if you teach for a long time, which I have. I mean, I'm not teaching now, but I have for decades taught in different places, different kinds of students here and here. You come to a number of irritating conclusions. You become rather glib at typecasting people from certain places. I'll just give one example, I hope it won't offend. But Greek males tend to be arrogant. Not absolutely 100%, but 98% of Greek males are naturally arrogant. You have to handle it, a lot of German students are morose. Oh, problem is. You say it's not a problem; it's an opportunity, etc., etc. English
what
people
about
are
Americans?
English. A bit boring, actually. I have to be honest. I find American students generally boring. I mean, there's some brilliant Americans, but proportionally.
What about Chinese?
Intriguing. I have Chinese assistants. I'm getting to learn more and more and more. Mind you, some of them are actually Chinese who went to school in England, so they start being layered by European kind of, they're sort of halfway house people. But I would like to speak kinder about the Americans, but I have to say, generally, if you have one American in a European group, they can be active, but they'll rarely do the most interesting work. And in their writing, they tend to be more concerned about making accurate references, but not having very interesting ideas. Sorry, this is a terrible generalization. It won't be a popular thing to put on your website.
Yeah.
But I'm speaking honestly, and at my age, you could say, if you don't like it, fuck off.
closer to the end of this conversation, do you now remember what was the fourth building in your lectures?
I ought to, because I put the slide together quite recently. No, I can't. Isn't that weird? So it must be the other three resonate more.
So maybe it's
It's
not
not
really
an
that
English
significant.
building. It's not an English building. It's not a South American building. It's not Bulgarian. It's not what it would be. No, I'm blanking.
How do you see the role of an architect?
I see the role of an architect ideally as an inventor. I think, that we can answer this question, what's going to happen to architecture, and, the predicament and threat of AI, and there are too many architects, and the robot can do it better, all this stuff. I think there's always going to be the need for the person who thinks outside the box. Now, it may be that traditionally there are professions or territories where you were expected to think outside the box. The painter is expected to conceive of not exactly necessarily reality, but things may be related to reality or whatever, responding. And the architect is expected to be sort of prosaic in the sense of practicality, but I think that has to change. I think if you want it done practical, you press the button and the robot does it. Robotics and AI and all can create this building. A building like this requires no particular thought other than, and then you put a bit of fins on the outside and pretend that it's
There's
architecture.
no connection between outside and inside. These are two independent
No, but
projects.
it's also, the task of, say, the inside, in its interpretation, anyhow, doesn't seem to require any sense of theatre, any sense of narrative. I mean, it's boxes.
Its purpose is to disappear.
It's a packing case for this or that. Now, whether you could then say, hey, hold on a minute, conference delegates are not morons. They also want to be titillated, entertained, amused. And you've got a park across the street. But nothing's been done with that. Wouldn't it be wonderful if you could walk out in the middle of one of these sessions onto a terrace amongst the trees?
For example,
It wouldn't cost that much to do it, but they don't. It's a sort of mindset, and that's what I get at. There needs somebody who then says, yes, okay, but you've got trees across the street, you could have a terrace. The entrance is not properly demarcated. We walk round and round the building. You probably did as well. There are a few things that are very simple that need a bit of wit, a bit of eye, a bit of nuance. And that will always be needed. Now, whether it's paid for, whether the public feels it's needed, intellectually and I would say culturally, it's needed. Whether you call that person an architect, I don't know, or a cosmeticist, or an artist, I don't care. And there's a predicament that we train far too many so-called architects, and then they sit trying to replicate what the robot or the computer can probably do better, which is a tragedy. But I mean, there have always been things like if you went to Italy years ago, or probably now, there are taxi drivers who say, yes, I have an architecture degree. There are waiters in London restaurants, they have an architecture degree.
Sad. You travel around the world all the time, participate in so many discussions.
No, I try not to.
Do you follow right now? Who would you distinguish?
I'm trying. That's why I'm so interested in your book. I'm very intrigued by the energy of China. I'm very intrigued by the fact that at various competitions and conferences and publications, I see more and more, like biennales, the most interesting people, often the Chinese. And to say they're simply borrowing it, that Ma Yan-song is child of Zaha is too simplistic. These guys are really interesting. Some of the smaller outfits, particularly, are really interesting in their own right. And at some point, they won't need to go and study in Ivy League or in London. They'll be generating their own thing.
I'm back at home.
In my lecture later this morning, I shall say this will be my own piece.
Okay. And what advice would you give to a young architect?
Look at things. Don't just go by a diagram. I mean, I have one quote which I give many times. many years ago, when I was teaching at the AA, I had a very good student. She was very beautiful too, which was always a pleasure, but she was very clever. And she did a bus station, and I was giving a tutorial. I said, Amanda, do you ever use buses? She says, of course I do. I came in on a bus this morning. I said, do you remember what you did when you got off the bus? She gave me a very sort of weird look, like, what the hell is this about? She had drawn the bus station the American way round, because she'd taken it, nowadays it would be the internet, at that time off a planning guide, which was an American publication. But she had not thought about the fact that every day she uses the bus, that her leg comes off the platform on a particular side and has a relationship with the thing. And she'd drawn what she, in other words, there was a disparity between her actual experience and looking and the fact she was a good student and she checked the diagram and that must be all right. And I keep repeating this because it tells you a lot, I think, about studies and the relation to reality. So I like to claim that when I'm designing, I'm thinking, I used to have a very, very old teacher, German, when I was at the AA, who used to say, walk me, walk me, walk me, walk me. It's a very good thing to ask. Walk me through and tell me what happens and how far it is and what you see.
Yeah, just like the project you described that you did in Graz, you finished with the wrapping, but it didn't came as the first gesture, right? So you
no, it came after the diagram.
Studying the
but then
context.
I'm of a certain generation where you had
Because
long,
many
expensive
architects do it the other way.
architectural education,
Yeah.
saying, how do you use this thing? Then how would you skin it? And then the process, what sort of space does it make and what sort of progression of space does it make? But I think that's basic, because it is.
But this is a wonderful way of describing a building, that you don't just propose a shape, you propose a certain structure, environment,
Yeah, the shape
and then
always
you
comes
skin
at
it.
the end, yeah.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean the shape can't be controversial.
Well, it is, in your case. Yeah.
And maybe it's more interesting if the plan is controversial. If you do an intriguing thing, like, for a reason. I'm Gothic. I think the Gothics were very good at this stuff. I think, I'm not a historicist, but I think some of the old guys were very, even the Assyrian temples or whatever, there's progression of a space to
And
space.
I think
the thing of the English Gothic cathedral where you come in on a side doorway, it reduces your scale. You then turn. You have an amazing scale. I mean, that trick, which was played often, it's a very simple trick, but wonderful. Rather than bringing in at the end and say, come in, oh, there we are, okay, it's very impressive.
I think
you come in this spooky little thing, almost down to that scale, and your head turns and suddenly, that's theatre. It also works quite well.
I think you mentioned somewhere that you are not a theoretician, you don't develop
No,
theories.
I'm not an
You
abstractionist.
Really,
I was hopeless at
Yeah.
things like physics and
Okay.
School. I wasn't interested. Anything
But
with a
you're paying-
narrative.
Yeah, and you're paying a lot of attention. And you're building a narrative, yes.
And then, of course, teaching for so many years, you become an armchair psychologist.
Yeah.
You can't avoid it.
What's the most interesting assignment you gave to students that you found effective?
It's always very funny. I mean, I've sometimes set what seemed to be a very interesting program. When I've had friends or commentators saying, oh, God, I wish I was a student again. I'd love to do that. But they didn't necessarily work. And sometimes, just to experiment, I'd set a very banal program.
And it produces great
and
results.
And it produces then the imaginative people. They make something from it. So I'm not, funnily enough, I'm a bit of a cynic certainly about curricula. Really bad academics love having meetings where they endlessly discuss changing the curriculum or changing the building or whatever. basically, I've seen really, really good schools of architecture taught by people who aren't at all known to the outside world, probably not very highly qualified, in bad buildings, but they're great schools because these characters understand how to teach, can inspire. I've seen wonderfully newly constructed architecture schools, people who've got, everybody's got at least a PhD plus, and they're...
And students are uninspired, right?
Yeah.
In that kind of sterile environment.
Yeah. And I think sort of a lot of people administering architecture schools, who tend to be academics rather than designers, are scared if you get an inspiring teacher. I've had a lot of case histories where I've interviewed students from other schools. When I was at the Bartlett, for example, would come there from a lesser-known school to finish the last 2 years. And then you discover, I used to be a detective, you find suddenly there's a group of people coming from somewhere in the provinces. One comes, interesting guy, okay. Next one comes, she's interesting too. Third one comes, also rather interesting. You think, what's going on there? There's an interesting teacher. The fourth one that shows up, you say, what goes on in your school? And then you discover there's a somebody. They mention the name of a teacher, as did the others. Then you say, that's somebody who's inspiring. It just shows in the, they're all different people. I mean, this is sort of what I'm talking about today.
I look forward to that. Good. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Peter. Thank you so much.